You see, as a kid, I lived in a place they called Dizneyland. Now, it wasn't called Disneyland because of the whimsical time one could have strolling around looking at the beautiful sights and tasting exotic cuisines. No. It was called Disneyland because there was always some fantastic way of getting murdered, witnessing a death, partaking in some kind of destructive act, or you can actually view the majestic nature by which drug lords would dispatch their minions to sell the kids. Or as it was in my case, use all of my time for survival. All my survival skills came in handy in this place, just to stay alive most of the time, or to have fun with my friends, which in many cases meant that we would be getting ourselves into some other kind of life-threatening trouble. But one day, we were on the playground. And of course, we were only on the playground after the Bloods and the Crips had finished their negotiating terms on how they would divide up Disneyland. It was myself and two of my friends, Chris and Dio. We all sat around trying to figure out, how we're going to purchase a machete for protection. Why a machete? Well, in the 80s, all the kids watched Kung Fu theater on Sunday. So we had this ingenious idea that we could fight gangs and the many wild dogs that roam the neighborhood using, something like what we saw in the movies. Something like a sword, let's say. But we knew we couldn't get a sword, so the closest thing was a machete, just like we saw in the shows we watched. Now understand that the reason why we all knew about this is because when I say all the kids watched the shows on Sunday, it's because at that time there was no internet. And whenever you watched a show, you had to watch it when that show came on. So everyone watched the same show exactly at the same time. So the next day, everyone knew the show that was on because it was the only time the show was on at that one time and everyone was on the same page. Whereas today, when you watch a show, you never know who watched it or who will watch it or who's currently watching it. So everyone has a different perspective on things based on the fact that not everyone's watching the same thing at the same time. In any case, this sort of influenced us as to how we should protect ourselves. And one of the ideas that came out of there was a sword, in our case, as I said before, a machete. But Dio wasn't really keen on the idea of getting a machete. He wanted something much more impressive, like what we would see in, let's say, like Terminator. And so he would say, well, why don't we just get a gun? I was confused by that question because I always considered guns to be sort of cowardly. And Chris, who had a few known murderers in his family, understood that using a gun was a fast way to get away to prison for a very long time. So, to throw Dio off the sort of scent of trying to get a gun, I just said, well, where we're going to get the money for a gun in the first place? Dio then suggested that, well, we can do what the Bloods and the Crips do. We can sell drugs. He began basically explaining how the only people he seemed to see get along or get ahead in life were two types of people. One, the cops that beat us, in his view, and the gangs that killed and harassed us, in his view. This is how he saw everything. So I said, well, first of all, guns are not for the good guys. And in my view, I thought that guns were not for the good guys from the movies I used to watch. And I always associated the ones who used the guns as the people who wanted to fight at a distance. And the ones who used the swords were people who were trained on something and who wanted to sort of fight with honor and some kind of respect, in my view. This is how I felt at the time. So Dio and I had a difference of opinion with this idea of whether we should get a gun or whether we should get a sword. Chris then said, well, the second thing is we don't have any money. Have you guys forgotten about that? And we both look at each other and we're like, well, yeah, so this argument is pointless because we don't have any money. Which was funny because although Chris spent a lot of his time in Disneyland, he actually lived in a large home outside the neighborhood among civilized people who actually made money by working. His father worked, his mother worked, he had a 2-parent home, and he had a very nice home, a very nice family. But he would come to Disneyland, I guess for the adventure, but this is where he would spend his time. It was known to us, though, that routinely Chris would be able to get money from his parents, either by taking it from his mother's lottery jar without her knowing, or asking his parents for money, and he can get money that way. But Chris was not offering up any money to get this machete idea that we were talking about. And no one really said anything. So Deal then said, well, we have no way of getting any money, right? Then we can't get a gun, or we can't get a sword. We can't get either one, is what he was saying. I quickly replied, well, if we need money, why don't we just get a job? And even as the words exited my mouth. So Chris just said, you know what? Look, I'm going home. My brother's going to take me to the beach, and that's it. I'm out. I'll see you guys tomorrow. Deal really needed to get home because he wasn't supposed to be on the playground. He wasn't supposed to be out doing anything because he was grounded. And what that meant, if his mom came home and he's not in his room grounded like he's supposed to be, he was going to get a good old-fashioned 1980s beating. His mom gets home, and she will look for a belt, a stick, a rock, a shoe, whatever she can find near her, and that was a good old-fashioned 80s beating. It was on the borderline of child abuse, because you never knew if you were going to be cut, beat, punched. Who knows what was going to happen during these beatings. So you tried to stay out of trouble. At least you try to stay out of enough trouble to where your parents couldn't find out. And normally what I mean by parents, I mean parent, because most of the kids there, aside from Chris, only had one parent, and it was the mother normally. So I decided to walk to Top Cat, the liquor store. So I was just going to spend the only quarter that I had, since I would never be able to afford a machete. Top Cat was the name of the liquor store. And if you can imagine the most run-down place with a mangy dog in the back tied to an old truck, old tires back there, and you can see all this from the street view, filled with graffiti, urine-smelling, rat and roach-infested store, complete with prostitutions on the corner, and gangs in their cars and loud music, then you'd be close to understanding what Top Cat had to offer. But you'd still be a ways off. In any case, I wasn't going to Top Cat to spend my money at the store. I was actually going there to get dried octopus from a Chinese man named Shen. He sold bags on the corner, so I would go to him to get this dried octopus. I befriended him a while before by returning one of the bags that Dio and Nathan had stolen from him. He returned my honesty, with one of his homemade beef jerky, I guess, jerked octopus tentacles, which at first I didn't like, and I eventually began to like over time, because it was so interesting to me. I've never even heard of that before, and eventually I started liking it and going back to him to purchase those for a quarter. As I gave Shen my quarter to purchase the jerked octopus, he noticed something was wrong. So I went ahead and explained to him my dilemma. I needed money to buy a machete. Shen immediately offered me a job, which was great. He said, well, if you stand around here and you look out for thieves and you help me pack up when I'm done, then eventually you'll be able to earn the money to get the machete that you want. Now, keep in mind, although Shen was a wise man, he was also a cheap person. He was the cheapest person you can ever find in Cheapsville. So if there was ever a place called Cheapsville, you go look around that place, find the cheapest person, and you'd find Shen. He would pay me about $3 a day. And eventually, over a very long time, I was able to save enough money to purchase my machete. And where I got the machete was from the old farmhouse where a farmer lived there with his family and his son. His son, I don't even think went to school, but, he was around our age, but he would work on the farm and stuff like that. And so I went there, and I was able to buy the machete from there. And it was on the edge of Disneyland, but still, basically, you could say it was in Disneyland. So not only did I sleep with this machete, I can tell you for sure, and this is another story, it saved me several times from a gang of people and a gang of wild dogs as I walked to school. The machete actually came in handy. So I kept that machete near me all the time. And in fact, I cut my belt in a way to where I can carry it on my side while I walk to school. Now, in order to hide the machete, I would always hide it either in the backyard. I would dig a hole or something like that so my mom or nobody would find it or anything like that. I would just be hiding it to make sure I would always have access to it and no one else would. unless I was walking to school. But one day, I walked to school, hide my machete, and I hear the teacher talking about this camp that's coming up. It's a summer camp, and it will be available for 3 days, meaning when you sign up for the camp, you go from Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and then you can come home on Monday, which is pretty amazing. And I was very excited about this. The deal was that if you were poor enough, the school would subsidize some of the camp. But the parents of the students who couldn't afford the overall price of the camp would have to pay $50 or, get someone else to pay the $50 for them. And so that was still a big deal because we were just struggling to make sure we had food and stuff on the table. The other thing is, if I were to work for Shin, that would be $3 a day. And the camp I think it was the next week. There was no way for me to have time to raise money from Shin or ever ask Shin for any sort of extra upgrade or money like that. Would never pass. I would probably be fired. And so that wasn't going to happen. So I figured, one way I could get this money was to sell my machete. And then I can go ahead and go to this camp. It was a hard choice because that machete meant security to me. It meant safety, and it already has saved me multiple times, along with the skills that I have to wield this thing. But I figure, here's a chance of a lifetime for me that I would be able to leave this place, at least for 3 days. I would be able to leave Disneyland, which was a major thing for me, even though it was camp. Now, it was about when I went to go dig up the sword, or the machete. I dug this machete up. I cleaned it off after school. And I started walking home. And I said, well, if I don't sell the machete, those are 3 days I'm here still in Disneyland. If I do sell the machete, I get to experience something other than Disneyland for at least 3 days. New people. People who may not be the same kind of people that I'm experiencing here. So that was the end of the conversation. I knew I would have to sell that sword. So the first place I went, the only place I knew of a person who can get that kind of money, was Chris. In short order, Chris came back with the money. No doubt he got it from his mom's lottery jar. And there it was. I sold my machete for what I was hoping to be a great time at camp, being able to leave the horrible place of Disneyland for a few days to experience something else. So the day of camp finally came. It was obvious that I was the poorest kid there because I was the only kid with raggedy clothes, $5 slippers that I wore for shoes. So these were what we used to call karate shoes. They were so thin, they were paper thin, and they had plastic for the bottom and then some thin cloth for the top. That's what I wore for shoes. And I had a small bag with some stuff up in there. I don't even remember what was in the bag, but it wasn't anything near what the other kids had. They had really nice clothes on. They had large prepared bags with extra clothes and toothbrushes and that sort of stuff in it. And it looked like that they had jackets and real shoes, as I said. And another thing that they had was packed lunches, which I noticed right away because some kids were trading stuff for their apples and doing all the stuff with the packed lunches that they would have. And when I was looking at these packed lunches, it looked like the parents took extra care with these packed lunches, and the parents had given these lunch boxes with Transformers on it, G.I. Joe on it, He-Man on it, She-Ra, all these other characters that I remember from TV, and every kid remembers from TV. So these kids had that, and they were just kids from regular families. There was the poor kids, and then there was me, who was a little bit below the poor kids, because even the poor kids had some stuff. But I tell you this, in any case, of all of that, I didn't care as long as I was leaving Disneyland. As long as I was leaving Disneyland, nothing else mattered. So as the bus drove away, and the kids were noisy, they were wild, the bus was bouncing, but the whole time, while all this is taking place and the bus is driving off, I stared out the window the entire time. I stared out the window because I wanted to experience the change in scenery from the depressing to a more welcoming place. As I stared out the window, the sound of the bus, the sound of the kids, and all things surrounding started to fade away. In the background, in my mind, I remember the trees, and I remember staring at the trees and remembering as we would pass the trees, as we left sort of the country area through the city area and up into the foresty area. I started imagining being a squirrel whose life was only occupied by gathering nuts. I remember thinking about this, about how simple life would be if all I had to do was be a squirrel and gather nuts. My eyes shifted to the soft clouds in the distance. In my mind, I imagined touching those clouds like a dream. As I stared at the clouds, I'd say a few minutes, I think, I saw in the distance a twinkle of light that seemed to shift from left to right. When suddenly my focus was broken, someone was calling my name. Malik, Malik is what they would say. They were yelling it as loud as they could. And I snapped out of it. And I noticed that as I looked around, I was the only person on an empty bus. And everyone else was outside taking roll call. Day one at camp was a quick tour of the facility. Quick rally, to meet the camp leaders and understand the critical rules of the camp. And, to basically meet and greet, that sort of stuff, get you used to the area. And obviously, predictably, on the first day of camp, you're going to meet the people who are the bullies. You meet the bullies right away, and you have to figure out how to hold your own or to be able to avoid the bullies, which normally doesn't work. And that's a whole nother story. We'll get to that some other time. But that was day one at the camp. At camp. Day two at camp comes along. Now, this is the day where all the fun activities are supposed to take place. This was going to be great. This is what I wanted to come to camp for, but it really didn't matter because I remember the night before, I had gone to sleep, I had rested, and I didn't have to worry about anything. I didn't have to worry about shootings. I didn't have to worry about domestic violence. I didn't have to worry about wild dogs roaming the street or anything like that. Most of all, I woke up in a place that wasn't Disneyland for the first time in a long time, let's put it that way, since we were there. So that next day was great. Not because of the activities, because again, it was the first time I was able to go to sleep without being afraid of the sound of guns, violence, fighting, and all of the other things that came along with Disneyland. After lunch that same day, the camp leaders organized a treasure hunt. And this treasure hunt was designed around the campground so that way people can win prizes. And, it was just a fun activity for all the kids and the camp leaders to do. At this time, all the kids were running around looking for things on the treasure hunt list, or the treasure list that they gave us. They gave us a list of things that we were looking for. And some things they didn't tell you that you were looking for, that if you found, you won a larger prize. The kids were running around like wild animals, screaming and acting crazy, just fun, just what kids do. And the whole time, I was like walking around. Now, I wasn't walking around looking for the things on the list or looking for things on the treasure hunt. I was walking around looking at the trees, being up close to the trees, looking at the soil, looking at the flowers. And the fact that I was walking around this place, looking at these flowers and the trees, that it was a safe place. I didn't have to worry about the next door neighbor or the gangs or the drugs or the dogs or anything like that. I didn't have to walk around with a machete. So it was interesting to me. And I was enjoying every minute of it on that second day. So, and keep in mind, this is after lunch. It was probably about noon or something like that. And so we had lunch a bit earlier than noon. All of a sudden, as I was looking around and walking around and looking at the trees, in the distance, near one of the trees, I looked and I saw a twinkle that caught my eye. It seemed like the twinkle that came from the clouds that I saw earlier. It was familiar. It looked almost the same. But I just figured that it was one of the hidden prizes It was one of those prizes that they tried to hide behind a tree, and it's a special prize that hopefully now that I'm going to find it, that I'd be praised by the camp leaders and also get a great reward for finding this item. So I went over and I walked over to the tree. As I got to the tree, I realized the twinkle, whatever that was once here, is not here anymore. And it seemed like it moved to another tree in the distance. So I said, okay, maybe I just thought it was at this tree, and it wasn't. It was always at that other tree. So I went ahead and I went towards the other tree a little bit further down. And as I approached this tree, there was no light. I eventually began to get extremely tired. It felt like I was being drugged, or like I was drugged. My body was under some kind of extreme pressure. It felt like gravity was increasing. And so I became extremely weak. So I sat down. And as I eventually got to the tree, I just had to rest. And I just sat down with my back up against the tree and sat down and figured that if I could just sit down for a few minutes, I'll probably feel better, and then I can go ahead and move. But this was odd to me because I never felt this way before. And then I saw another twinkle of that light. The same twinkle that I saw in the trees, the same twinkle I saw in the clouds before. I saw it again in the clouds, this time while sitting next to this tree. It didn't really mean much to me. I mean, maybe I'm seeing something, as I thought. So I just sat there to recover, because I was getting more and more tired. Not sleepy, but tired. So I sat there for about a few minutes, I would say about 3 or 4 minutes. And as I sat there, I was looking down at my hand. I was looking at the ants meticulously inspecting my hand. I just stared at them for a while. And as I was looking at the ants, I wondered how it would feel to be so small, to be such a small thing, surrounded by so many big things that you don't know that's looking at you. And what I felt was about, like I said, 2 or 3 minutes, maybe even 5 at the most, of sitting there. I then got up and I felt a little bit better. And so as I regained my strength, I got up and I started heading back to the camp, since there was nothing here, obviously. And I wanted to continue this treasure hunt because I'm wasting my time here, is what I thought. So as I approached the campground, everyone was frantic. It was like a completely different scene almost. And actually, the kids were different. They were wearing different clothes, and there was police there. I mean, it was just madness. I think I saw police, kids, camp leaders, and what looked like some of the kids' parents there. And I thought to myself, man, this treasure hunt must be huge. Whatever they're looking for, whatever we're looking for must be very valuable to these people. So I slowly, calmly walked over to one of the little girls who was looking through bushes, wandering around, looking behind, the cabins and stuff like that. And I asked her, I said, hey, did anybody find a reward? Did anybody find the prize? What exactly are we looking for? Did anybody find it? And she still kept looking around, and she just said, oh, yeah, no one's found him yet. And I said, found him? I said, what are you talking about? What are we looking for? What's so valuable? And she said, a boy. And I was confused because I asked her, what kind of prize is a boy? And she turned around and looked at me, and right as she began to speak, she saw me and started to scream. And she began screaming at the top of her lungs, here he is. It's him, it's him. She actually grabbed my arm and started pulling me. And she kept screaming. I was like, oh my, what's wrong with you? I thought she was nuts. And then everyone turns around, and they look. And their eyes widen. And I realized everyone was looking for me. It was weird, because I had no idea why this was happening. They picked me up. They hugged me. Some people hugged me. Just noises and sounds everywhere. 1,000 questions hit me at one time. But I was still confused. I really didn't know what was going on. Eventually, After everything settled down, I was told that I had been missing from Saturday to Sunday. After that lunch, I had been missing until Sunday. For 2 days almost. I was told that this was the last day of camp. That we were concerned and that they tried to contact my parents. They tried to contact my mom and they couldn't. So they ended up calling the cops and everyone was looking for me. They asked me, how did you survive the night? Who were you with? What happened? They were asking me. But I kept telling them that I only sat down for a few minutes. And I still wanted to go to camp, is what I kept saying. I still wanted to do the treasure hunt. I wanted to play the games. I wanted to spend the time at camp that I wanted to spend initially. Friday, Saturday, Sunday, till Monday. But that wasn't going to happen. Camp was over. All the kids were put back on the bus. Many of them said their goodbyes to the camp leaders, to everyone that they were everyone they eventually got to know over the past 3 days. Everyone experienced 3 days at camp, except for me. I remember as the bus pulled away, all the kids, they were waving and crying. Many of them didn't want to go because they would miss the people that they got to know and they had fun with. But myself, I sat there and I was crying inside. I actually spent a day of daydreaming. One day at camp, and it was back to Disneyland. Like the clouds, leaving Disneyland was a great idea. But an idea that only looked tangible from the distance. And when you get close, it evaporates with wind and time.